Snow lay in broken sheets across the Norman bocage, and in the cold blue of early morning, a peculiar silhouette loomed over a ruined farmyard. A British Churchill, intact, abandoned after a night skirmish, its long tracks draped like iron ladders around the hull. German officers ringed the prize with notebooks and field cameras. They had read reports of the British infantry tank that moved like a fortress and crept like a miner through places other machines avoided. Reports were one thing. Seeing the machine up close, heavy, narrow, impossibly long, was another. It looked anachronistic, almost pre-war in line and posture, yet the tracks told a different story. They ran nearly the full length of the hull, wrapping high over idlers and sprockets to give the vehicle the stance of a mountaineer. The armor, dense and vertical, bore gouges from near misses and ricochets. The engine deck smelled of hot oil and wet soil. Its reputation for trench crossing and cliff scrambling felt like an exaggeration born of propaganda, until the ground itself began to explain it. The infantry tank doctrine had shaped this machine. Not a racer, but a bulldog built to escort foot soldiers through wire, ditches, and rubble. Where fast cruisers dash for open country, the Churchill advanced yard by yard, using gearing that favored torque over speed and suspension travel that let the hull hinge its way across broken ground. In Tunisia, it had crawled up wadis. In Italy, it had shouldered terraces and mule tracks. On the Channel coast, it had survived where others stalled. Here, the captured example stood as evidence of that lineage. Late war marks armed more capably than the first, but still defined by one talent above all: the ability to go where tanks were not meant to go. The officers mapped the courtyard like a proving ground. A stone retaining wall ran shoulder-high along a churned lane, topped by frost and rubble. Nearby lay a drainage ditch glazed with ice. The obstacles formed a natural test: vertical face, sudden drop, sharp exit. Measurements went into notebooks. Angles were paced and repaced. The Churchill's proportions, wheelbase long, belly shallow, track shoes wide, promised improbable leverage. Low first gear and the Bedford Twin Six's steady pull would substitute for brute speed. The plan was simple: idle at the base, bite the stones with the leading shoes, let the long run of track climb its own ladder, and drag the hull over on friction and weight. Engines elsewhere in the farmyard were silent relics of the night. Crows watched from rafters. Mud showed the rakes of dozens of failed attempts by lighter vehicles. The wall waited, damp and unwelcoming. If the reputation was myth, the stones would say so. If it was real, the courtyard would witness something few armored men admitted possible: a 40-ton box of steel scaling a vertical face by geometry alone. Steel settled, snow hissed from fenders, and the long tracks tightened like muscles before a lift. What happened next would travel through staff reports and mess rumors in equal measure, altering how an enemy was imagined. Not fast, not elegant, but relentless, with a talent as old as siegecraft. The frost cracked underfoot as the officers spread out to watch. The Churchill sat low and patient at the base of the stone wall, its tracks pressed into the frozen mud like the prints of a prehistoric beast. Every line of its design seemed to defy logic. Tall armor slabs, narrow hull, ungainly length. Yet there was purpose in every inch. Its long track, run, and deep-set suspension gave it an advantage that few realized until they saw it move. It wasn't built to look graceful. It was built to ignore terrain altogether. The morning light revealed the craftsmanship of the British tankers who had abandoned it only hours before. The armor bore soot streaks and scratches from ricochets, the smell of cordite still faint on the breeze. One of the German engineers ran his hand across the thick plates and found the steel still faintly warm. The tank had survived a battle, climbed through the hedgerows, and now sat before them as a captured enigma. They had studied countless Allied designs: the quick, angular Shermans, the squat and practical Stuarts, even the odd American experiments. But none of them looked like this. The Churchill's very form suggested stubbornness. Its engine wasn't powerful by German standards, but it delivered torque that never quit. The gearbox, complicated yet enduring, allowed it to grind forward even when one side bogged down. It was a tank that accepted punishment as part of its nature. The test began slowly. The driver eased the controls. the big Bedford engine grumbling into life, diesel smoke curling out into the freezing air. The sound wasn't sharp like a German Maybach. It was low, steady, almost agricultural. The tank rolled toward the wall, its heavy tracks clattering over stones and ice, exhaust turning the air into a white mist. The officers watched as the first few track links met the base of the wall, pressed against the stones, and then, impossibly, began to climb. The suspension flexed downward, the bogies compressing in unison as the leading edge of the track gripped the rough masonry. Inch by inch, the nose rose from the ground. The weight distribution shifted, the rear idlers dug deep into the mud, and the tank pulled itself upward, almost vertically. Frost shattered under the pressure. The entire 40 tons of steel ascended, not with speed but with sheer inevitability. By the halfway point, the Churchill was nearly perpendicular to the ground, its rear tracks clawing the earth while its front reached the top of the wall. A few stones tumbled away under the immense strain, but the tank never faltered. Its engine note deepened, unyielding. One more surge of power, and the front of the hull cleared the wall completely. Then, with a slow, grinding motion, the tank pulled itself over, cresting the obstacle like a mountain climber dragging his weight over a ledge. It landed on the far side with a heavy thud that shook the ground, snow cascading off its hull. The engine idled calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The German officers were silent. Some scribbled in their notebooks. Others simply stared. They had seen light tanks leap trenches and half-tracks claw their way up slopes, but never had they seen a 50-ton vehicle treat a vertical wall as if it were a minor inconvenience. What they had just witnessed wasn't a stunt. It was a demonstration of a completely different design philosophy. The Churchill was not made to win races or hunt tanks. It was made to endure the impossible, to climb out of shell holes, to crawl through ruins, to keep moving when everything else stopped. The Germans had spent years perfecting the art of speed, precision, and firepower. The British, it seemed, had perfected persistence. As the sound of the engine faded into a slow idle, one truth settled over the group like the falling snow. They hadn't just captured an enemy tank. They had uncovered a machine built with a kind of genius that could only come from necessity. The afternoon light turned gray as snow began to drift through the air again, settling on helmets, notebooks, and the still warm hull of the Churchill. The tank rested beyond the wall now, half shrouded in mist, its exhaust cutting faint trails through the freezing wind. The German officers moved closer, pacing slowly around their new prize. They were methodical men, engineers, tacticians, and mechanics, and what they had just seen did not fit neatly into their understanding of tank warfare. They had been trained to think of armor as a weapon of precision, an extension of industrial superiority. Every German tank, from the nimble Panzer III to the mighty Tiger, was a product of careful balance, speed, armor, and firepower arranged in elegant tension. But this British machine was something else entirely. It was crude in appearance, yet cunning in execution. It had survived a war of attrition not by finesse, but by a design philosophy that put survival above all else. The officers gathered by the transmission access hatch. When they opened it, a gust of warm diesel air met the cold. The gears inside were immense, their surfaces pitted but intact, and the engineering, though simple, was brutally effective. There was no delicate synchronization, no fragile gearing. It was as though the designers had anticipated that mud, ice, and shrapnel would invade every part of the machine and built it to ignore them. In their reports, German engineers had often criticized Allied tanks for their lack of refinement, their rough welding, and their inconsistent tolerances. But here, standing over this machine, such criticisms felt hollow. The Churchill's seams might not have been smooth, but they were unbreakable. Its rivets might not have gleamed, but they had held through shellfire and storms. Every imperfection was a signature of purpose. They decided to test the tank further. The wall had proven its climbing prowess, but now they wanted to know its limits. Ahead lay a trench, narrow, deep, carved by melting snow and frozen runoff. It was the kind of obstacle that could trap even a medium tank if approached too sharply. The Churchill, they reasoned, would never cross it. They were wrong. When the driver engaged first gear again, the engine growled low, like a living creature sensing a challenge. The tank rolled forward at a crawl, snow crunching beneath the tracks. As the front edge reached the trench, the suspension flexed with eerie grace. The Churchill's long hull bridged the gap, its tracks spanning both sides without the slightest sign of strain. The onlookers leaned forward, watching in disbelief as the tank slithered across the void, nose dipping, rear lifting, but never breaking balance. When it reached solid ground again, it pulled itself free effortlessly. The only sound left was the heavy sigh of its engine cooling in the wind. The officers marked the trench's width in their notebooks. 6 meters, 6 meters of empty air, conquered without a pause. A few of the men stepped forward to inspect the ground. They found the tank's tracks had barely disturbed the snow at the edges. It had done what even many German tanks could not, passed an obstacle that defied geometry and gravity alike. The Churchill had not been designed to impress. It had been designed to keep moving, and it did so with a stubbornness that defied physics. As dusk fell, the officers stood in a semicircle, the dark outline of the tank before them. Steam rose from its hull like breath from a beast at rest. Beyond the tree line, the distant thunder of artillery rumbled through the hills. For a moment, it was easy to imagine this single machine crawling through the smoke of Normandy, scaling walls, bridging ditches, dragging itself out of craters, and surviving everything thrown at it. In that cold silence, they understood what the Churchill truly was. Not a tank in the German sense, but a siege weapon reborn. A moving fortress from another age, indifferent to elegance, dedicated only to progress, 1 inch at a time. By dawn the next morning, the snow had stopped. The world lay silent beneath a thin veil of ice, and the Churchill stood like a monument among the ruins, its steel hull streaked with frost, its treads etched with the mud and gravel of the previous day's tests. The German officers returned to the site bundled in overcoats, their breath hanging in the air as they prepared for the next series of trials. They had spent the night reviewing notes and schematics, sketching the dimensions of the tank, arguing quietly over its strengths and flaws, but no argument could explain what they had seen. Now they wanted to understand why it worked. The first inspection began beneath the tank, where engineers lay on frozen tarps, peering into the underbelly of the Churchill. What they found astonished them. The suspension, a maze of bogies, springs, and rollers, was far more complex than it appeared from the outside. Each set of road wheels was independently sprung, allowing the massive tracks to mold themselves to the ground. Where a German tank would tilt, rock, or dig into the earth, the Churchill simply absorbed the terrain like a living thing. Its tracks were unusually wide for its weight, granting it traction on surfaces that would trap a tiger. The steel links were thick, but the tension system was forgiving, allowing the track to stretch slightly under strain rather than snapping. It was overbuilt, perhaps even primitive by German standards, but it was indestructible. They documented the details with precision: the gearbox ratios, the angle of the armor plates, the steel composition of the hull. Yet for every flaw they noted, the tank seemed to present an equal strength. Its armor, though vertical and old-fashioned, was astonishingly thick. Its engine, underpowered on paper, delivered torque that few machines could match. Its profile, high and boxy, gave it space for large crews and easy field maintenance. It was not a tank meant to dazzle engineers. It was a tank meant to survive soldiers. When they restarted the engine, the deep rumble echoed across the valley. Diesel smoke drifted into the pale sky, and the tank's vibration could be felt through the frozen ground. They decided to attempt one more obstacle: a collapsed barn wall, nearly 2 meters of debris and stone. No one expected it to manage the climb. The angle was too sharp, the footing too unstable. Yet as the treads bit into the rubble, the Churchill began to ascend once again, unhurried, unstoppable. Chunks of brick shattered under its weight. The suspension flexed. The hull tilted dangerously, but the machine never faltered. It climbed over the ruins with the same calm inevitability as it had scaled the stone wall. At the peak, its silhouette cut across the horizon like a moving fortress. Then it descended, slow and deliberate, landing in a plume of dust and snow. When the engine settled into idle, the silence felt immense. The officers looked to one another, but there were no words left to speak. Every expectation of Allied armor had been overturned. In their minds, German engineering represented mastery, precision, elegance, superiority. But this British design revealed something far more unsettling, strength born not from perfection, but from persistence. The Churchill was not beautiful, but it was honest. It made no promise it couldn't keep. It didn't break down at the first hint of mud or freeze in the cold. It was ugly, heavy, slow, and it would not stop. One of the engineers stared at the tracks, still warm from friction, and scribbled a final note. It climbs because it must. It survives because it was never allowed to fail. The rest nodded in quiet agreement. Around them, the frozen fields stretched toward the horizon, empty and endless. And somewhere beyond that horizon, hundreds more Churchills were crawling through the same cold gray dawn, proving one obstacle at a time that persistence could be more terrifying than speed. The wind returned by midday, sweeping across the fields like a knife. Snow flurries whipped through the ruined farmstead where the Churchill sat idling, steam rising from its engine deck in thick, rhythmic bursts. The German officers gathered again, their notebooks already thick with sketches and diagrams. But now their expressions had changed. The initial curiosity had faded into something closer to respect, a silent acknowledgement that what they had found here was no accident of luck or design. It was intent. They had tested the tank's limits for 2 days now, forcing it over walls, trenches, and rubble. Every time it performed the impossible. And yet the most startling thing was not what the Churchill could do, but what it endured. Its armor bore new scars from impacts, yet no cracks had formed. Its suspension creaked under the weight of punishment, but not a single wheel had failed. Even its engine, now streaked with oil and soot, continued to start with the same stubborn reliability that had confounded them from the first morning. The British had built a weapon for war in the worst conditions imaginable: mud, frost, debris, chaos. It was not a tank that depended on perfect supply lines or careful maintenance. It was a machine designed for imperfection, for real battlefields where every inch of ground was an obstacle. The Germans, for all their technological brilliance, had created tanks that required care like thoroughbreds. The Churchill was a mule, slow, unlovely, tireless. The engineers had now turned their attention to the tank's internals. They dismantled access panels, traced fuel lines, studied the air intakes, and measured the armor composition. Beneath the surface grime, they discovered simplicity. Everything was accessible, replaceable, repairable. Even the wiring harnesses were labeled and routed with a mechanic's logic. This was a machine meant to be fixed in the field by a cold, exhausted crewman with frozen hands and a wrench, not a factory technician. It was this practicality that startled the Germans most. Every nation claimed to build for war, but few did so without illusion. The British had taken no pride in elegance or speed. They had built endurance into every bolt and bearing. Outside, the temperature began to drop again, and frost formed along the hull seams. They decided on one last trial for the day, a test of power. Across the field lay an abandoned German half-track, its engine frozen, its wheels sunken into the snow. They chained it to the Churchill's rear towing hooks. The orders were simple: pull it free. The driver eased the throttle, and the diesel engine growled low, steady. The tracks bit into the snow, the heavy steel cleats finding purchase in the ice. With a sudden lurch, the Churchill began to move, dragging the half-track behind it as though it weighed nothing. The tow chain tightened, then slackened again as the Churchill advanced, unmoved by resistance. Snow erupted around the treads as the machine powered forward, its exhaust painting the air in clouds of smoke. The half-track jolted free with a metallic shriek, torn from the frozen ground. The Churchill continued to drag at another 20 meters before stopping, the chain clinking softly in the quiet that followed. The German officers stood still, their breath visible in the cold. They no longer took notes. There was nothing left to measure. The tank idled for several minutes more, the steady heartbeat of its engine filling the winter air. Then the driver shut it down, and the sound faded into silence, leaving only the faint ticking of cooling metal. In that stillness, the realization settled like falling snow. The Churchill had been underestimated, not because it was flawed, but because it was honest. It did not try to be something it wasn't. It was slow, heavy, outdated, and utterly dependable. To the Germans, it was a revelation wrapped in armor and grease, proof that the measure of a tank was not its elegance, but its endurance. The sixth morning broke under a steel-gray sky. The snow had crusted into hard ridges overnight, and the bitter wind from the east swept through the camp with the sound of tearing canvas. The Churchill sat where it had stopped the previous evening, half buried now, its outlines softened by frost and drifting powder. Yet even in stillness, the tank looked alive, its long tracks half sunken in the ice, its turret slightly turned, as if it had paused mid-march and would resume at any moment. The German officers rose early, shaking off the fatigue that had settled into their bones. None spoke much anymore. Their tests had gone beyond mechanical curiosity. What they faced now was something closer to disbelief. They had seen tanks falter under less strain than this. The tigers that dominated propaganda reels could crush enemies in battle. Yes, but in the cold, in the mud, in the frozen heart of winter, even they broke. The Churchill, it seemed, did not. They began a long inspection that morning, not to test its strength, but to understand its endurance. They drained the oil and found it clean, the filters still intact despite the cold. They measured fuel consumption and found it higher than expected, but consistent. The British engine was not efficient, but it was unwavering. Where a German Maybach might seize from precision, too fine for winter grit, the Bedford engine hummed along, indifferent to conditions. They removed access panels, studied the welds along the armor seams, and found that even where the steel had been roughly cut, it held firm. The craftsmanship lacked refinement, but exuded resilience. It was built for necessity, not prestige. The engineers began to realize that the Churchill's secret was not superior technology. It was the absence of fragility. It was a tank that refused to break simply because it lacked anything delicate enough to break. As noon approached, they tested the machine's traction on the icy slope behind the farm. The hill rose steeply, packed with frozen mud and glazed with snowdrifts. It was terrain no German tank would have attempted. The officers wanted to see where the limit lay. The Churchill started at the base, its tracks grinding into the ice with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a glacier in motion. The engine groaned, the hull tilted, and the nose rose into the climb. Snow sprayed from beneath the cleats, glinting in the pale light. It clawed upward, the suspension flexing to meet every ridge and rut. Halfway up, the slope steepened sharply. The track slipped once, then caught again, the engine roaring low but steady. The men held their breath as the heavy machine continued its ascent, climbing, sliding, then climbing again, inch by inch. And then, with one final surge, it reached the top. The tank paused there, idling calmly, black smoke curling upward into the frozen air. It had done what seemed impossible, conquered a slope that would have sent even a Panther tank sliding backward in failure. When it descended, it did so with the same patient certainty, its brakes and gears working in perfect coordination. No drama, no stalling, no panic, just control. Back at the base of the hill, the German engineers exchanged glances, their expressions heavy with a kind of reluctant admiration. What they had seen could not be dismissed as luck. It was a deliberate triumph of practicality, a philosophy alien to them. In their reports, they would later write that the Churchill's greatest strength was mechanical tolerance, its ability to function under conditions that destroyed more refined machines. But beneath that technical phrasing lay something deeper. They had seen a machine that embodied endurance itself, a steel mirror of the stubbornness that had kept Britain fighting long after defeat had seemed inevitable. As night fell, the men gathered in the dim lamplight of their quarters, the sound of wind howling outside. They spoke softly now, not of improvements or weaknesses, but of lessons. The Churchill, in its own quiet way, had taught them what true strength looked like, not in brilliance, but in resilience. The seventh day began under a veil of fog. The wind had quieted, leaving the world muffled in gray silence. The camp seemed to have aged overnight, tents sagging under frost, cables stiff with ice, and men moving slowly through the cold. The Churchill, however, stood unchanged. Its olive hull now dulled by frost and soot, it looked almost eternal, as if the snow and time themselves had simply flowed around it. The Germans had planned one final phase of mechanical study. Every nut, bolt, and weld would be cataloged. They would tear apart sections of the tank to understand how such a cumbersome machine could move with such authority over terrain that swallowed others whole. By this point, the officer's tone had shifted entirely. Gone was the condescension that had colored their first impressions. What remained was reverence, tinged with unease. They began with the engine compartment. The Bedford power plant was laid bare again, its heavy pistons and broad cylinders exposed to the icy air. Compared to the precision-tuned Maybachs in their own machines, it looked almost crude. The tolerances were loose, the machining rougher, the connections simple. But therein lay its secret. The looser tolerances meant the parts could expand, contract, and still function under freezing conditions. Where German engines would seize, the Churchill's engine merely groaned and pushed on. They examined the air intakes, fitted with wide, simple filters that could be cleaned by hand. They noted how easily panels opened, how access ports were positioned for field maintenance. There was nothing elegant about it, yet everything had purpose. It was designed not for the factory floor, but for the mud and cold of real war. One officer measured the gear teeth inside the transmission and stopped mid-count. The gears were thick, heavy, and designed to operate at brutally low speeds. He realized that the Churchill could apply enormous torque even at a crawl. It didn't need speed, it needed patience. And patience, in battle, could win where power could not. After hours of disassembly and note-taking, the engineers paused for rest. The fog outside had thickened into a pale mist. The tank loomed half visible through it, the dark outline of its tracks just barely emerging from the snow. It looked less like a machine now, and more like a monument to something greater. An idea, perhaps, that endurance itself was a weapon. In the afternoon, they decided to test the tank's durability under fire. A captured anti-tank gun was brought from the depot, its barrel cleaned, its crew assembled reluctantly. They loaded armor-piercing rounds and aimed them at the Churchill's frontal plate from a controlled distance. When the gun fired, the sound cracked through the still air. The shell struck the armor with a flash of sparks and a dull metallic roar, sending snow and smoke outward in a wave. When the haze cleared, the officers stepped forward. The shell had left a deep scar, but no penetration. The armor, nearly 6 inches thick at some points, had absorbed the blow with ease. They fired again, this time at the turret side. The result was the same. A crater in the steel, but no breach. The Churchill had shrugged off the hits like a stone wall struck by hammers. For a long moment, no one spoke. The gun crew stood staring at the dented hull, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. The engineers exchanged silent glances. It wasn't just the thickness of the armor that impressed them. It was its composition. It didn't crack under stress. It flexed, absorbed, and held. The British had not built a tank to outgun the enemy. They had built one to outlast him. As dust settled, the fog glowed faintly with the last light of day. The Churchill stood there scarred but proud, smoke still curling from its exhaust. Around it, the German officers finished their sketches in silence, the only sound the scratching of pencils and the faint hiss of cooling steel. They had begun their study believing they would expose the flaws of Allied engineering. Instead, they had uncovered something humbling, a tank that defied both logic and expectation, a machine that endured because it had been built not for glory, but for survival. And in that revelation, even the proudest among them felt a trace of envy. The 8th day opened under a pale winter sun that struggled to pierce the low clouds. The light was thin, almost colorless, reflecting off the crusted snow like dull steel. Around the test site, the air hung still, heavy with anticipation. The Churchill tank, its once green hull now marred with soot, ice, and the black scars of shell impacts, looked every bit the veteran of 100 battles. It stood silently beside the shattered wall it had climbed days before, a symbol of defiance made of rivets and resolve. The German engineers had assembled their final performance trials. After days of climbing, towing, and firing tests, the Churchill would face a challenge of endurance. They wanted to see how far it could travel under constant strain, through mud, snow, and debris. It was to be a marathon of mechanical willpower, And though the machine itself was indifferent, the men around it felt the tension like an unspoken challenge. The driver climbed into the seat, turned the crank, and once again the Bedford engine came to life with its familiar, guttural rumble. It was a sound that had haunted their camp all week. Not sharp like German engines, but deep, steady, and unyielding. The engineers followed as the tank began to move, its tracks clanking against frozen ground, leaving behind a trail of melted snow and churned mud. The course stretched over several kilometers, through an old orchard, across an icy stream, and up a series of steep embankments where German tanks had struggled before. The Churchill moved like a creature that knew the ground beneath it. It was not fast, barely above a walking pace, but it never faltered. Every obstacle became another demonstration of its strange, stubborn genius. When it reached the stream, the Germans held their breath. The frozen crust gave way beneath the front tracks, sending shards of ice flying. Water splashed up across the glass's plate and froze instantly in the cold air. The tank dipped, groaned, and then, almost lazily, clawed its way out of the freezing mud, steam rising from its exhaust like a ghost. It didn't hesitate, didn't struggle. It simply kept moving. Further ahead, the embankment awaited, a steep, uneven rise of earth that had stopped lighter vehicles before. The driver throttled up slightly, and the Churchill began to climb. Its long tracks pressed deep into the slope, displacing snow and stone, gripping the ground with the weight of inevitability. Slowly, methodically, the tank crested the top and rolled onto flat ground once more. The German officers followed on foot, their boots crunching through snow. By now, they weren't even taking notes. They knew what they were witnessing defied the conventions of armored design. Every German tank, from the nimble Panzer IV to the fearsome Tiger II, relied on balance, precision, and mechanical finesse. The Churchill ignored all that. It was the embodiment of brute endurance, heavy, outdated, and yet unstoppable. Hours passed. The machine continued without pause. The engineers checked gauges, measured fuel use, and found the reading steady. Even as the cold deepened, even as the mud turned to ice, the engine never sputtered, never slowed. It seemed almost willful, as if the tank possessed its own quiet determination. By sunset, the Churchill had completed the full course. Steam rose from its hull, carrying the acrid scent of fuel and oil. The engine idled calmly, the sound echoing faintly across the frozen landscape. The Germans stood in a semicircle around it, frost collecting in their eyebrows, their notebooks closed. They had run out of words. What stood before them was not simply an armored vehicle. It was a lesson carved from steel, a reminder that power alone did not define victory. The British had built this tank with no illusions of glory. It was made to fight uphill, through mud, through rubble, through the kind of endless misery that broke men and machines alike. The Germans, for all their pride in precision and perfection, could not deny what they saw. The Churchill's power came not from brilliance, but from resilience. As darkness fell and the stars began to shimmer faintly over the snow, the tank's engine was finally shut down. The silence that followed was immense. For a moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that frozen stillness, the officers knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not the triumph of technology, but the triumph of endurance itself. The ninth day began with a brittle cold that turned every surface to glass. The camp was hushed, the kind of silence that only deep winter could command. The German engineers moved slowly now, their breath freezing in thin plumes as they gathered around the Churchill tank for what they knew would be their final full day of study. The tests were complete, the reports nearly finished, yet no one felt ready to walk away from the machine that had defied their expectations so completely. The Churchill sat as it always did, still massive, indifferent. Its armor was blackened by exhaust, its corners dusted with frost, and the edges of its tracks were polished bright by the punishment of snow and stone. It looked somehow alive, not in movement, but in the quiet presence of something that endured everything thrown at it. The morning was devoted to final examinations. The engineers inspected the hull seams, measuring for fractures or strain. They found none. The armor had absorbed shell fire, climbed walls, crossed trenches, and yet remained solid. Even the suspension, which had been pushed to its limit over days of brutal terrain, showed no cracks, no bent components, no signs of fatigue. They turned next to the engine. The Bedford Twin 6 had become the unlikely hero of the study, a power plant that no German engineer had respected before this trial. They drained its oil again and found it remarkably clean. The pistons, still warm from the previous day's exertion, gleamed with an oily sheen. The filters had performed flawlessly despite the dust, mud, and frost. One of the mechanics ran his hand along the gearbox casing, tracing the rough welds. Everything about the design was overbuilt. Heavy steel housings, thick bolts, simple connections. It lacked refinement, but it was honest. Every part existed for one reason: to keep the machine alive as long as possible. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying snow across the open fields. The officers gathered near the tank's tracks and studied the ground. The deep impressions left behind told their own story. Perfect. Even tread marks. No sign of slippage or uneven pull. The Churchill had distributed its weight so well that it barely sank, even in thawing snow. They knew now that this was more than an engineering study. What they had uncovered was the logic of a different kind of warfare, one born not from industrial superiority, but from necessity. British design philosophy had never aimed for perfection. It had aimed for persistence. In Berlin, the planners spoke of victory through precision. Every part of a German tank was crafted to exacting standards, a work of industrial art. But here, in the frozen quiet of a captured field, those ideals seemed fragile. The Churchill was a different kind of perfection, one that embraced imperfection as a weapon. By afternoon, the tests were complete. The officers lit a small fire near the barn ruins and gathered around it, their reports stacked in neat folders beside them. Pages filled with diagrams, measurements, and fuel calculations fluttered in the wind. Yet no report could truly capture what they had learned. Numbers could explain performance, but not purpose. The Churchill's greatest strength was invisible. It was the philosophy behind its steel, a belief that war was not won through speed or elegance, but through the unbreakable endurance of men and machines that refused to stop. As the day waned, one final demonstration was proposed: a cold start after full exposure. The tank would be left in the open, unheated, overnight. In the morning, it would face temperatures nearing minus 25 degrees Celsius. If it could start again after that, it would prove beyond doubt that its reliability was unmatched. The engineers agreed. The tank was shut down, its hatches sealed. The wind howled through the camp, covering it in frost. One by one, the officers retreated to their shelters, glancing back at the looming shadow in the snow. The Churchill sat there alone, half buried in the storm. Ice began to form along the edges of its armor, coating the turret in glassy layers. The world turned white around it, the snow falling heavier as night swallowed the horizon. In the morning, they would return for one last test, one last chance to understand the heart of this steel creature that had humbled them all. The 10th morning dawned beneath a hard, silver sky. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under a glistening sheet of snow and silence. The German engineers stepped out into air so cold it burned the lungs. Their boots cracked through the crust of ice as they crossed the yard toward the Churchill tank, or rather the mound of frost that hid it. Overnight, the machine had become a monument of ice. Its silhouette was barely visible, its turret and hull encased in frozen stillness, as if the earth itself had claimed it. This was the final test. For days they had studied its strength, its endurance, its impossible ability to climb and crawl and survive. Now they would test its spirit, whether its heart of steel could awaken after a night of killing cold. They brushed away the frost, their gloves stiff and useless against the biting wind. The metal beneath was so cold that touch burned through the fabric. Every vent was sealed with ice. Every bolt rhymed white. The tank seemed utterly lifeless. Yet those who had watched it move knew better. They gathered around the engine bay, set up the crank handle, and began the process. At first there was only silence, a deep, empty quiet that swallowed even their breath. Then faintly, the slow grind of machinery stirred beneath the steel. The first attempt failed. The crank refused to turn freely. They tried again. Metal scraped, groaned, resisted. The air hung heavy with frost and suspense. And then, on the third attempt, a spark, a low coughing rumble that echoed like thunder through the frozen camp. The Bedford engine, sluggish at first, came alive. Diesel smoke poured from the exhaust, black against the white morning. The ground trembled underfoot. The sound was not just mechanical, it was defiant. The men stepped back as steam rose from the hull, melting snow away in thin, hissing streams. Ice shattered and slid from the armor, the tank shaking itself free like a creature waking from hibernation. The temperature still hovered near minus 25 degrees Celsius, yet within minutes the engine settled into a steady, confident rhythm. The Churchill was alive again. The Germans stood motionless, their faces lit by the pale light of the fire-belching exhaust. They had witnessed precision. Now they witnessed endurance that bordered on the supernatural. No machine of theirs could have done this. Not a Panther, not even a Tiger. Those marvels of engineering required warmth, fuel mixtures, and maintenance. The Churchill required only will. The driver tested the transmission. The tank moved forward through the snow, its tracks crunching steadily, leaving behind deep, perfect impressions. Steam swirled around it as it advanced, the engine humming as though it had never slept. As it passed through the yard, the men realized something profound. This was not a marvel of technology. It was a statement of philosophy. Where Germany had built for domination, Britain had built for survival. The Churchill did not boast or intimidate. It simply endured, and in endurance lay its power. Kruger, the senior officer, stood apart from the others. He watched the tank until it stopped again, its engine idling quietly. The smell of fuel and frost hung in the air. He thought of the months of war behind him, the endless defeats and victories measured in steel and fire. Yet here, before him, was something that outlasted all of it. He understood finally what made the machine great. The Churchill did not conquer through brilliance, but through refusal. Refusal to stop, to freeze, to fail. It mirrored the soldiers who drove it, the factories that built it, the stubborn island that refused to surrender no matter how the odds stacked against it. By the time the sun rose fully, the Churchill was still running, its hull steaming, its heartbeat steady. The German engineers closed their notebooks for the last time. There was nothing left to record. What they had learned would not fit into numbers or reports. It was something deeper, something felt rather than measured. As they turned away, one last gust of wind swept through the camp, carrying the sound of the engine across the snowy field. It echoed faintly, like a living memory, the growl of a machine that had survived the impossible and would do so again. Long after the war ended, men would forget many things, names, numbers, even victories. But those who had stood there that morning would never forget the sound of that engine starting in the cold. Because in that moment, amid the frozen silence of winter, the Churchill had proven one eternal truth, that true strength is not in perfection, but in endurance. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.